Greetings and welcome back to 303 in Junior English. We turn now in our hymnals to page 808, 809. We are going to meet the great American author Tim O'Brien, who we're going to be looking at his story here in a second, called Ambush. Let's read together on page 808, 809 as we meet this really influential author. A short story that is also part of a novel. Let's read. Ambush is part of a larger work of fiction, a novel called The Things They Carried. But I must quickly add that the story is also meant to stand entirely on its own. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It can be understood and appreciated, I hope, with no additional information. The next heading, an invented character who has my name. Although the main character in the story is named Tim, which is my own name, and although many years ago I did in fact serve as an infantryman in Vietnam, Ambush is nonetheless a piece of fiction. The events in this story are largely invented. The characters too are invented, including the character named Tim. I don't have a daughter, for example, and until very recently I had no children at all. As a novelist and short story writer, I am not limited by what actually happened. In fiction, I am free to write about what did not happen. I can write about what almost happened, or what could have happened, or what should have happened. Next heading, fact versus fiction. While the story is mostly imagined, it is loosely based on a real-life ambush during the war. The mosquitoes, the trail junction, the dark night, the tension, all that comes from my own experience. In the actual incident, however, I did not throw a hand grenade that killed the young man. As it truly happened, a group of 7 or 8 of us simultaneously fired our rifles at 3 shadowy, barely visible enemy soldiers creeping across a rice paddy. One moment the night was silent, the next moment it exploded. Gunfire and screams and yellow-white flashes in the dark. Later, when dawn broke, one of my friends discovered a dead Viet Cong soldier. But I did not inspect the body. I did not so much as glance at it. I certainly did not stand gaping like the character in the story. Page 809, last heading, confusion and lament. I will never know whether a bullet from my own weapon killed that young man. Perhaps so, perhaps not. But in the end, it doesn't matter. I was there that night. I pulled the trigger, and I am therefore responsible. In my view, that's what Ambush is finally about. Responsibility. Let's write that down. That's going to be an important part of our story. Responsibility. Who is responsible for the death of someone? Even now, like the protagonist in the story, I still have trouble forgiving myself. I still hear the gunfire and the screams. I still have the sour, fruity taste of terror in my mouth. I still feel the guilt. And I suppose that's why I sat down one day to write Ambush, as a kind of confession, as a lament, as a way of acknowledging my full personal responsibility for the death of a fellow human being. One of the things that makes Tim O'Brien such a powerful writer is that he had the experience, and now I'm with you on page 811, is that he had the experience of being required through the draft to participate in the Vietnam conflict. He didn't want to be there. He had to be there. And upon his return, he uses his fiction and his writing often to try to come to terms with the experiences of what that was like. We have the short story now from the larger collection, the larger novel. The short story is named Ambush. Let's now turn to the reading of the story. And let's play now the game of following along and trying to get a sense of the central conflict. So write this down. What is the central conflict of this story? As we study, again, short fiction, we're always asking about that thing called plot. The beginning, the exposition, the rising action, the conflict, and of course the climax when the conflict comes to its fruition, and then the falling action, the resolution, the denouement, the end of the story. Let's get a sense of how this story's plot unfolds. Let's pay attention to conflict. Let's pay attention to characterization as well in the development of the character. All right? Okay, we've got a professional reader now reading along. Let's follow along.
Ambush. From the Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. When she was 9, my daughter Kathleen asked if I had ever killed anyone. She knew about the war. She knew I'd been a soldier. "You keep writing these war stories," she said, "so I guess you must have killed somebody." It was a difficult moment, but I did what seemed right, which was to say, "Of course not," and then to take her onto my lap and hold her for a while. Someday, I hope she'll ask again. But here I want to pretend she's a grown-up. I want to tell her exactly what happened, or what I remember happening. And then I want to say to her that as a little girl she was absolutely right. This is why I keep writing war stories. He was a short, slender young man of about 20. I was afraid of him, afraid of something. And as he passed me on the trail, I threw a grenade that exploded at his feet and killed him. Or to go back. Shortly after midnight, we moved into the ambush site outside my K. The whole platoon was there, spread out in the dense brush along the trail, and for 5 hours, nothing at all happened. We were working in 2-man teams. One man on guard while the other slept, switching off every 2 hours. And I remember it was still dark when Kiowa shook me awake for the final watch. The night was foggy and hot. For the first few moments I felt lost, not sure about directions, groping for my helmet and weapon. I reached out and found 3 grenades and lined them up in front of me. The pins had already been straightened for quick throwing. And then for maybe half an hour I kneeled there and waited. Very gradually, in tiny slivers, dawn began to break through the fog, and from my position in the brush I could see 10 or 15 meters up the trail. The mosquitoes were fierce. I remember slapping at them, wondering if I should wake up Kiowa and ask for some repellent, then thinking it was a bad idea, and then looking up and seeing the young man come out of the fog. He wore black clothing and rubber sandals and a gray ammunition belt. His shoulders were slightly stooped, his head cocked to the side as if listening for something. He seemed at ease. He carried his weapon in one hand, muzzle down, moving without any hurry up the center of the trail. There was no sound at all, none that I can remember. In a way, it seemed he was part of the morning fog or my own imagination. But there was also the reality of what was happening in my stomach. I had already pulled the pin on a grenade. I had come up to a crouch. It was entirely automatic. I did not hate the young man. I did not see him as the enemy. I did not ponder issues of morality or politics or military duty. I crouched and kept my head low. I tried to swallow whatever was rising from my stomach, which tasted like lemonade, something fruity and sour. I was terrified. There were no thoughts about killing. The grenade was to make him go away, just evaporate. And I leaned back and felt my mind go empty and then felt it fill up again. I had already thrown the grenade before telling myself to throw it. The brush was thick, and I had to lob it high, not aiming, and I remember the grenade seeming to freeze above me for an instant, as if a camera had clicked, and I remember ducking down and holding my breath and seeing little wisps of fog rise from the earth. The grenade bounced once and rolled across the trail. I did not hear it, but there must have been a sound because the young man dropped his weapon and began to run, just 2 or 3 quick steps. Then he hesitated. Swiveling to his right, and he glanced down at the grenade and tried to cover his head, but never did. It occurred to me then that he was about to die. I wanted to warn him. The grenade made a popping noise, not soft, but not loud either. not what I'd expected, and there was a puff of dust and smoke, a small white puff, and the young man seemed to jerk upward as if pulled by invisible wires. He fell on his back. His rubber sandals had been blown off. There was no wind. He lay at the center of the trail, his right leg bent beneath him, his one eye shut, his other eye a huge star-shaped hole. It was not a matter of live or die. There was no real peril. Almost certainly the young man would have passed by. And it will always be that way. Later, I remember Kiowa tried to tell me that the man would have died anyway. He told me that it was a good kill, that I was a soldier and this was a war, that I should shape up and stop staring, ask myself what the dead man would have done if things were reversed. None of it mattered. The words seemed far too complicated. All I could do was gape at the fact of the young man's body. Even now, I haven't finished sorting it out. Sometimes I forgive myself, other times I don't. In the ordinary hours of life, I try not to dwell on it. But now and then, when I'm reading a newspaper or just sitting alone in a room, I'll look up and see the young man coming out of the morning fog. I'll watch him walk toward me, his shoulders slightly stooped, his head cocked to the side, and he'll pass within a few yards of me and suddenly smile at some secret thought and then continue up the trail to where it bends back into the fog.
Now, this is a difficult story to read, no question, and for sure a difficult story to annotate. But I want to start at 2b and ask the simple question, maybe not so simple to answer, why? Why is this such a compelling story to read? Go ahead and jot down your observations here. What is it that makes this story? I've had students that say, you know what? Of all the stuff I've read in high school, this may be one of the most compelling things I've ever read. But why? Well, there's several potential answers. One potential answer is the story is written in the first-person narrative. We have the whole event through the eyes of the individual, the fictional character who participated, who did the ambush, right? Who threw the grenade. And so you have this very strange kind of, almost like you're there. It's almost like you're experiencing this kind of thing. Number 2, some students have reported that what's compelling about the story is the way it begins and ends. That actually it's not the middle of the story, it's the stuff at the beginning. When a man is holding his little girl in his lap and she asks him, did you ever kill anyone when you were in the war? And he lies and says no. And then the very end of the story, when it's not his little girl, but it's a young soldier, the Viet Cong soldier, who walks right by him, and in his mind's eye, he can imagine making eye contact and a smile even from the young man who ultimately in the story is the victim of the ambush. And what makes those two bookends of the story so compelling then for students is often this realization that war will remove innocence. Let's work at level 1 now, just real briefly to summarize the story. Of course, the story, we could say, is just a retelling, a flashback to an event that happened many years prior when this individual, as a young man, was forced to participate in the Vietnam War. And on an evening watch, early morning watch, he has to take the life of one of his enemies, the Viet Cong. In the process of doing that, notice there's several interesting things that have to happen. For example, he has to go through the process of deciding, and then he has to go through the process of living with the decision. Right? At 2a, we are met obviously with questions about messages and themes. Now, Tim O'Brien has taken some hits by people who are critics of his, who say that he often seems to be unpatriotic because of his suggestion that he didn't enjoy the experience of going to Vietnam and fighting for the United States military. But O'Brien's response to this has been, in my fiction, I try to present both sides. That is to say, the idea that when one is in a battle situation, one has to not only protect oneself, but protect one's colleagues and troop members and the like. But at the same time, one is often convoluted about how one feels about what one is being asked to do. Look on page 812. Let's study this part of the story really quickly. We are told about the young man walking down the path, the trail. By the way, just make an observation of the genius of O'Brien. This again is a work of fiction, okay? This didn't actually happen this way. But notice the eye to detail. For example, notice the mentioning of the sandals several different times, the plastic sandals, right? Immediately telling us this is not a Viet Cong soldier that, for example, is a full military uniform with army boots and that kind of thing, but has plastic sandals on, rubber plastic sandals on, which makes him more like of the indigenous population, right? But let's go ahead on page 812 and take a look here at what it is that will happen at the moment when the character in the story decides to launch the grenade. I had come up to a crouch. He says I'd already pulled the pin on the grenade. I'm reading now right next to the picture there on page 812. I had come up to a crouch. It was entirely automatic. Then notice what he says. I did not hate the young man. I did not see him as the enemy. I did not think about issues of morality or politics or military duty. I crouched and kept my head low. I tried to swallow whatever was rising from my stomach, which tasted like lemonade, something fruity and sour. I was terrified. There were no thoughts about killing. The grenade was to make him go away, just evaporate. And I leaned back and felt my mind go empty, and then felt it fill up again. Then we're told I had already thrown the grenade before telling myself to throw it. Jot down in your notes, what do you think are major themes or messages from a story like this? Some students have pointed out that this is an anti-war story, pointing out the tragedy of war. Other students have pointed out that this is not an anti-war story. What this is this is a story that explains the cost of war. It's not only the people who die in war, but it's the people who kill in war, who have to live and come to terms with the decisions, the challenging decisions in wartime. Some students have pointed out that one of the major themes of this story is youth and maturity or old age. Notice the story begins with a young girl. In the story you have the young man who does the ambush and the young Viet Cong soldier. The story ends with an imagined young Viet Cong soldier smiling. And yet the perspective of the story is told, obviously, from the perspective of an older person who is looking back to a moment in his life that he admits he's not proud of and he still has to come to terms with, especially you notice in moments when he's all alone, reading a newspaper or sitting in a room alone. The thought will come back to him. Another major theme, of course, of this story message is that we have to live for the rest of our life sometimes with decisions that we make when we are young. And sometimes those decisions that we make are very, very uncomfortable ones. And we have to come to terms with that over and over and over again. The mind, of course, will often resurrect again and again and again a situation that we were a part of when, we had to make a decision or whatever. And we try to let it go, but it keeps coming back. And then we have to work through it again. Of course, you notice that one of the ways that there seems to be kind of, for Tim O'Brien, he said, a way to work through the events of the Vietnam experience is through writing about it. It's kind of maybe cathartic. For those of us who love to write, we maybe think about how writing is a way for us to deal with the challenges, the garbage of our life, we might say, right? And we find this as an example here. Let's jump to 2B really quickly. We've already kind of had a few things to say here about what makes this story compelling from the storytelling perspective. Back to the Hemingway passage in Another Country. Notice how O'Brien plays a very similar game. Notice how the sentences we just read are very short, direct, To the point. I had already pulled the pin on a grenade. Full stop. I had come up to a crouch. Full stop. It was entirely automatic. Full stop. I did not hate the young man. Semicolon. I did not see him as the enemy. Semicolon. I did not ponder issues of morality or politics or moral or military duty. Period. I crouched and kept my head low. Put in your notes how at 2B. How, again, rhetorical. Not what a writer says, but how a writer says it. Notice how these short staccato-like sentences, right, work with the very scene that he's describing. As one junior student said, it's almost like you're there, right there, watching or even participating as you kind of have these short little sentences that tell you not only what the character is doing, but even what the character, notice it's not what the character is thinking, but what the character is not thinking, right? And then finally the line, I was terrified, right? A compelling line, right? To give you a sense of the emotional state, right, of the character. Compelling, right? Good, compelling writing. Okay, let's go to level 3 now, and let's talk at 3A about the relationship to other titles that maybe you're familiar with. Of course, we can immediately think of Hemingway's In Another Country. That's one we could write down. Go ahead and jot down other titles for you. Movies, maybe video games, texts that you are familiar with that deal with war, that deal with death. What is your favorite movie, for example, about the Vietnam era? The great filmmaker Oliver Stone made the film Platoon a number of years ago. And then there was a series of films after that, Born on the 4th of July, and a number of other filmmakers who tried to come to terms with the experience of not only Vietnam, but other fighting experiences as well. What is a movie for you where an individual returns from conflict and the war and has to kind of deal with that? There's all kinds